Multinational firms and China have maintained a strange love-hate relationship with each other for over 2 decades. At least since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, if someone walked into the boardroom of a large global company's headquarters, at least part of the discussions would have been about China. But recent years brought a dramatic change about the nature of that discussion. While for nearly 2 decades, global executives worked very hard to find ways deeper into China's investment and market opportunities, in recent years, the discussions turned to decoupling or at least mitigating the risks of the country's changeable and increasingly hazardous market environment, sometimes labeled as de-risking. One tangible consequence of this deteriorating partnership between China and the rest of the world has been a shrinking expatriate population in China, in simple words, foreigners leaving the country. Some studies estimate that over half of the foreigners living in China have left during the past few years, and to many people it sounds obvious that the reason was the COVID-19 pandemic. True, pandemic-related restrictions lasted longer in China and in some major cities disrupted normal life much more drastically than in many other countries. But in this video, I would like to challenge that narrative and show you that, in fact, most foreigners left China not during the pandemic, but right before or right after, and did so due to reasons unrelated to viruses. The distinction makes an enormous difference. Even as you listen to this video, thousands of executives and human resources professionals are crafting their China strategies all over the world. Now, if what many call the expat exodus happened because of the pandemic, it is realistic to expect Chinese foreign population to recover after these restrictions are lifted. But if foreigners left for other reasons that persist after pandemic-related restrictions have been lifted, China's expat population may not recover or even keep falling in coming years. I am Gabor Holch, intercultural leadership coach and consultant living in China for over 20 years and currently splitting my time between Europe and China. To understand why most foreigners did not leave during the pandemic, we must refresh our memories about how COVID-19 engulfed the world and some specific circumstances in China. China was the first country to experience widespread consequences of the virus, but at that time, nobody knew what would happen next. Most foreigners living in the country thought COVID-19, or if you remember, coronavirus, as we called it then, was a local issue. Many stayed because they didn't want to spread the virus to their home regions. For example, when I visited Europe in the spring of 2020, I voluntarily home quarantined as the problem started to become more serious in Europe. Others stayed because once they would have left, it was hard to return to China due to restrictions of movement. But many foreigners stayed simply because they wanted to help. You see, people who move across the world and spend some of their best years far away from home are often the adventurous type who enjoy challenge and want to put themselves to the test. They tend to follow Winston Churchill's advice to never let a crisis go to waste. Many executives and managers I coached around the time remained in COVID-stricken China for the opportunity to learn about themselves, service, and leadership. One executive that I interviewed for my recent book, Dragon Suit, said, in the spring of 2020, the firm offered us free tickets if we wanted to return to Brazil. She told her husband, if we leave now, my team will never trust me again. Perhaps I could use the pandemic as an opportunity. As 2020 progressed, COVID-19 became a serious problem worldwide, and most foreigners who already lived there decided to stay because, frankly, China seemed like one of the safest places to be. In late 2020 and then 2021, when many countries suffered serious restrictions and losses of life, we lived relatively normally in China. I delivered leadership team workshops sometimes through a face mask, made keynote speeches, and even trained at a martial arts boot camp. Another reason to keep foreigners in China was that once someone left, it was either impossible to return or had to suffer a terribly inconvenient 2 to 3 week quarantine experience, as I found out on my own return. But for expatriates whose previous life had consisted of international business trips, home leaves thousands of miles away, and vacations in nearby countries, there was virtually nowhere to go anyway. And with its relatively lively and vast internal market, skiing in the north and beaches in the south, China was the place to be. So if it wasn't due to the pandemic, when, and more importantly, why did foreigners leave? A closer look reveals two waves of foreigners leaving China, especially from countries with advanced economies like the United States, European Union, Japan, Korea, and Australia. One is what we could call a pre-pandemic wave, and it has started years before COVID-19 became a household name, but intensified around 2018 and 19. Another wave exited China as the world recovered from the worst of the virus from late 2021 onwards, which I will call a post-pandemic wave. Foreigners left the country under very different circumstances during these two waves, but I do believe that there is an underlying trend that is important to understand for everybody doing business in or with China. The earliest study I remember about a consistent departure of foreigners was the Sino-Benelux Business Survey report in 2019, but that had already looked back on a number of previous years and showed a drop of about 6% per year. Around the same times, foreign chambers of commerce and research institutions came out with a string of reports highlighting the steady loss of China's foreign population. Apart from usual reasons that made foreigners move away after a few years, like excessive work hours and restricted internet connectivity, polls at that time found new grievances, including China's slowing economy undermining the career prospects of expatriates, bothersome trade wars between China and its most important trading partners, and a toughening political and regulatory environment in the country. It is hard to know exactly how many foreigners left China by 2020 or during the pandemic. The only officially published statistic on their numbers is the national census, which only takes place once a decade. The last one took place in 2020, but much of its data reflected the situation on paper. For example, how many foreigners had a permit to live and work in China, rather than how many were actually present during that COVID-stricken year. Many expatriates were moved out of the country by their multinational employers, often urgently. A few of the expat executives I coached went on Lunar New Year vacations with their families to beaches in Southeast Asia in early 2020 and never returned. Their firms hurriedly flew them home with their lightly packaged carry-on suitcases and shipped their household items after them in a few months. As I mentioned, those who had a choice often stayed, but by late 2021, it was obvious that a large-scale departure of foreigners was taking place. Then 2021 turned into 2022, and most of the world gradually recovered from the devastation of COVID-19. But for foreigners living in China, the worst was yet to come. As expatriates prepared to send their kids back to school, dusted off their business suits, and redefined their China dreams, in the spring of 2022, Beijing, the Chinese government, introduced drastic lockdowns in major cities, which phenomenon is known in English as zero COVID. And that ground daily life, and with that foreign business, to a near complete halt. Places of business, from retail stores to Shanghai's recently built Tesla mega plant, had to shut down or maintain reduced operations under warlike restrictions of movement. Foreign executives couldn't even reach the airport, not to mention their international investors, clients, or suppliers. Families were often split between cities or countries where one member got stuck and couldn't return. Many struggled for food along with the local population, and also struggled to keep up with Mandarin language updates on what is happening in the country. Understandably, it was after these draconian restrictions were lifted that many foreigners decided to leave China. Again, we have no precise numbers about the magnitude of this second wave of exodus, but it was dramatic. One German chemical firm I asked this summer told me that the number of their foreign employees dropped from 200 before the pandemic to 10 this year. And recent polls show that many international firms emptied out of foreigners completely. One indicator is that out of the 20 executives that I interviewed for my book Dragon Suit, only 2 stayed in the country after this period. Importantly, I call this wave post-COVID because by this time, foreigners could leave China for countries far ahead in terms of pandemic recovery, including North America, Europe, and the favorite destination for former China expats, Southeast Asia. The psychological impact of zero COVID is just as important as food shortages, of the scarcity and staggering price of flights in and out of China. Sadly, it seems that the trust of many foreigners living in China was irreversibly shaken and is unlikely to recover soon. Then, late last year, Beijing lifted zero COVID just as haphazardly as they had introduced it. Normal life and business partially recovered since then, and some managers resumed travel in and out of the country. As I toured cities with my book on foreign executives in China, Dragon Suit, at least one person in every audience asked me the question, are expats coming back? Frankly, I doubt it. Surveys since the early 2000s consistently showed that international experts and managers moved to China with their families in search of the financial and career opportunities presented by double-digit GDP growth and the country's steady opening to foreign business. Neither of those factors will attract large numbers of foreigners today. A slowing economy, together with what foreigners experience as a worsening regulatory and political environment, consistently showed up in polls among international business people in China. The proportion of firms that have moved or plan to move some of their operations away is also on the rise. Another thing to know about expats is that they like living near other expats. With the large-scale departure of foreigners from major Chinese cities, the ecosystem of international colleagues, friends, schools, clinics, and restaurants began to crumble, making China a less attractive destination for expats. That doesn't mean, however, that no foreigner will come to China anymore. Polls also reveal a few promising trends for those who happen to look for opportunities as expats in China. First, while in general foreign firms complain about the worsening business environment in China, companies in a few dynamic industries such as automotive, chemicals, green energy, or legal services recruit and bring foreigners to the country. Startups, especially in the technology sector, also seem to be more optimistic about prospects in China than large firms and may offer opportunities for investors and job seekers. Finally, after a complete ban for over a year, international students are allowed back into China again, and their numbers are cautiously rising. Another reason why I don't think that foreigners will flock back into China soon, apart from the visible lack of a post-COVID economic recovery boom, is that it became so easy to work with China remotely during the pandemic years. The reasons are many and diverse. To start with, former China expats that I call dragon suits in my book have always hated restricted internet. If during the pandemic years, they spent some time in digital nomad hubs like Singapore, Thailand, or the United Arab Emirates, where friendly visa and taxation policies combine with unrestricted internet access, they are often reluctant to return. Their firms may allow them to run their Chinese teams remotely, saving time and cost on Chinese bothersome visa procedures and a still patchy and overpriced system of international flights in and out of China. Finally, COVID and zero COVID hit Chinese firms just as hard as foreign ones. And many of these Chinese firms responded with setting up operations in the same, usually Southeast Asian locations as international companies withdrawing from China. So today, a Western multinational can often relocate to India, Vietnam, or Indonesia, and once there, can still work with the same Chinese suppliers as before. In short, a recent outflow of foreigners is unlikely to be followed by a similarly intensive inflow in coming years, and that requires a rethinking of the China strategies of many international firms. If you want to find out a little bit more about this, follow my upcoming videos for insights and practical tips, not only about doing business with China, but about intercultural challenges in leadership in general. I left a few links in the show notes where you can buy my book. You can reach out and message me. You can schedule a free call, especially if you want to go a little bit deeper and want to work with me as a coach or an advisor. Find me online and drop me a line.